Welcome to Global South Forum. We are from Global South Forum. Today we have distinguished fellow Dr. Manan Dwivedi. Hello sir. Welcome to the Global South Forum. And I would like to introduce Dr. Manan Dwivedi sir. Dr. Dwivedi has authored several books and he is a distinguished US foreign policy expert, and he has worked extensively over South Asia US relation and also about how South and North interacts with each other. So I would like to mention some books written by Dr. Dwivedi. Serendipity and the American Dreams, Trump's America, Diplomacy and Economic Policies, About America Beyond the Oregon Trail, Internal Security Threat of South Asia, South Asian Security are one of the most renowned books written by Dr. Dwivedi. Dr. Dwivedi is distinguished scholar and a sphere of international relations, American foreign policy and critical IR theory. You are this assistant professor at Indian Institute of Public Administration and very reputed author of several books about IR. You have contributed in seminal and pioneering research papers to journals like Diaspora Studies, Indian Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Third World Studies, South Asian Democratic Forum, World Focus, Politico, NAM Today, and many more. You are also part of Track to Diplomacy on India-US relations, being on editorial board of Routtledge India. We welcome to our show, sir.
Thank you. It's a nice opportunity that I have been invited, and we are part of this narrative which we are going to spawn for your organization.
I would like to tell our audience what is Global South Forum. So Global South Forum is an initiative by JNU students, particularly from Latin American, African studies. We are motivated by the idea that domain of IR is highly dominated by particular trends that is circulated since long. Realism, liberalism, century-old IR theories are there, but modern trends are changing, and with evolution of new theories, we tends to enrich into the new arena where South cooperation comes. So we are here to make Global South Forum as a place to discuss the agendas and issues and criticize those issues that makes theories irrelevant today. IR studies is concentrated and focused over powerful countries. It has exclusionary tendencies. We tend to include those issues which has been excluded by previous theories, and previously IR theorists haven't reached. Yes, I am talking about the poor countries who have been categorically placed in the Global South as divided by Brandt Commission in 1980s, that Global North is rich and Global South is poor. So we are here to present capabilities that is created and recreated of Global South and new kind of interaction evolving. So here we are in talk with the Dr. Dwivedi. So my first question to you, sir, being expert on US foreign policy, how do you see the division of the world theoretically? For instance, in empirical age, world was divided into colony and colonizers, masters and slaves. While in Cold War, there was two blocks, and communist and capitalist, and there was third narrative, that was third world. And Brandt Commission vigorously categorically stated that world divides into two parts, north and south. North is rich, south is poor, and they have created geographical latitude. So how USA perceives this north-south issues, does it mean anything for US?
I personally feel, and as far as my understanding and comprehension of the discipline, of US foreign policy goes, I would just like to contend very pithily that there is a term which we can latch on to very easily and very conveniently without much of a thought, and that happens to be that of national interest. Like you just narrated in your introduction, you talked about the arcaneness and the obsoleteness of the theorizations which are part of realism, neo-realism, liberalism, risk society, critical theories. But still I would say that United States of America, being the most powerful nation state in the entire international ecosystem, has to be given its due. But if we analyze, or if we chronologically and historically look into the American foreign policy, then it is the idea of, I completely agree with you, the idea of selfish national interest and serving one's foreign policy objectives that has become the order of the day, or the norm de plume, or let's say the core figment, the core segment, or the premise of US foreign policy. And I don't see that there is anything wrong if a nation like in New Delhi, like India, or if Washington, or if Moscow attempts to create a kind of a strategic and geopolitical and geo-economic space for itself. But in this madcap run of hard power politics, in this eulogization of one's own nation or one's own civilization, the countries which suffer definitively are the developing countries, that is the LDCs. The least developing or the developing nations are the ones which have to bear the brunt of these of the foreign policy, national interest oriented foreign policy of countries like United States of America. Here I would like to contend that if we look at the history of the American foreign policy, one can say it all began with the Louisiana Purchase in the 1870s. One can cite the instance of the US-Spanish War, which was definitively the initiation of the hegemony, American hegemony or American unilateralism, as is the order of the day now. It went on to, Americans then went on to go into Philippines, they went on to become part and parcel of World War II, and Woodrow Wilson entered very late, the Americans, because of President Wilson, entered very late into the fray as far as World War I is concerned. And then we can look into the quagmires of Vietnam, Korea, the Korean War. We can look into the global south interventions of America, such as Nicaragua, Guatemala, Grenada, so Iraq, which is once again a part of global south, and how they are dealing with Iran. So one can say, to summarize or to surmise very pithily, that US foreign policy has been pretty selfish, and the stark objective, the stark instrumentality of national interest and the self-aggrandization of the American power, pelf and prestige, that has always been the prime mover and shaker of the American foreign policy. That is what I would like to articulate my views, and we can have a later discussion.
Sir, you talked about global south intervention of America. In global south areas, America has intervened several times. There was no contenders except USSR when it was. Present time, America intervenes in particular any developing or less developed country. There is no such contenders. So don't you see that global south is unilaterally delegitimized by such hard force, hard power? So in that cases, how do you see it would be countered by countries like India, because India is self-sufficient for itself, but it is not able to provide shelter to another country. So in that case, how do you see, how long will it take, or will USA keep on going like this, or its hegemony will be countered somehow, particularly in hard power politics?
Definitively, it's a very nice and pertinent poser that you have lobbed onto me. I would just like to contend here that when we talk about United States of America its so-called imperialistic aims, its so-called hegemonic aims, there I would like to moderate myself. There I would like to correct myself to a certain extent, partly but not fully. That United States of America is a liberal democracy like India. And I think the idea of natural allyship or allyhood was very much part of New Delhi's foreign policy. When Prime Minister Modi invited President Donald Trump to Motera, Ahmedabad, when he himself went to the Madison Square Garden and really enthralled and captivated the audience in United States of America, when he went to Houston, when he went to the San Jose Shark Tanks to confabulate with the energy companies of United States of America. So there what we can see is that there is a kind of a major element, a major drive of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's foreign policy, where a convergence and a congruence of national interest between New Delhi and Washington has been attempted. Now, I personally feel that China is a competitor. Apart from China locking horns with India at places like Sumdorong Chu, Dapsang, at places like Galwan Valley, when we look at the leadership of the South, the leadership of the global South, there also China happens to be a kind of a competitor. For example, when we look into the case studies of African countries, or when we look into the Chinese ministrations in Latin America, what we are going to find is that the general modicum of debt trap diplomacy that is being very assiduously followed as a kind of a marketing theme for the Chinese nation, Chinese global economic overarch and the Confucian culture. And here India has to really reform its global outreach. If we are to be recognized, we have to divert our diplomats for the global South. We have to divert our funding, more of a funding to the global South, so that India can be considered as one of the top runner leadership of the global South, or to use another term, the third world, which was categorically rejected by scholars such as Chilcote and Tickner in 50s and 60s. So I think India should not generally aim, as was the mistake done by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. We are not completely negating the idea of the non-aligned movement, but we have to relook, or we need to revisit the general idiom of the NAM and the Panchashil movement, where when you are not itself powerful, then at that point of time India was not able to feed its own population. Let's be very frank about it. And it was Americans, through their technology and through their agricultural modicum, they came to the aid of India. They took money, and India's sovereign concerns took a beating somewhere, but still Americans came to India's aid in 50s, and Green Revolution was initiated in India. So India during the Nehruvian times attempted to become the leader of the global South without intrinsically developing its own potential, strength and girth. But as you have rightly pointed out, we are an emerging nation. We are knocking at superpowerdom as far as the United Nations and the entire international firmament is concerned. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi has gone on to contend very vociferously and plan very vociferously that India practically becomes the leader of the global South through its funding mechanisms, through its diplomatic leadership and through its outreach. And your Asia Pacific countries are an example. How China went to the Solomon Islands, how the Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, he visited the Solomon Islands and he wants to contain India. They want to contain United States of America so that we do not get a strategic and geo-economic perch in the Southwest Pacific or in the Asia Pacific region. So India is going on the right path, which was very idealistic, which was very nebulous as far as the Nehruvian times are concerned. But Prime Minister Modi is actually trying to tangibly and physically help the global South, and we have lot of competition at our hand because China, through its nefarious activities, through its deleterious foreign policy, buying and selling and owning the local concerns, has really dealt a blow to countries like Sri Lanka. We can take the example of Sri Lanka, wherein Sri Lanka is a victim of the debt trap diplomacy, which was launched by United States of America at that particular by China at that particular point of time. And today Sri Lanka has seen a third prime minister within a small time frame of 2 months, and India has doled out what all Modi ji could do. We have doled out money to them, and they are once again with a platter in their hands and going to the World Bank and IMF. So India has a lot of potential, and New Delhi's foreign policy emanates from the neighborhood, emanates from the near neighborhood, and that kind of a Modian foreign policy is good. And we are not blankly and in thin air talking about global south. We are actually trying to navigate through the eyes of great power politics. That is what I would like to contend briefly.
Absolutely, sir. You talked about global souths have some element of great power politics because it is interrelated somehow. Also, you have talked about, sir, India has developed its potential in last 50-60 years, and during NAM India didn't had capabilities, but now India have capabilities. So with new capabilities and evolving identities, India is reaching out to the new nations with new approaches. So in that context, how do you see the new identity of India has emerged, and how Indian identity can be integrated with southern identity? Because we don't look ourselves so integrated with south and neither integrated with north. We are in some gray area. So as being a leader of global south, how we can see the new emerging identity to be fit in southern countries?
Definitely. Now I would like to take you back to the American growth, to the American rise. If we look at the American growth and the American rise, or to be more precise, I am using a very high-fly word, a very high-flown word, the grandiloquent American dream. We also have an Indian dream, but we did not forget about Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. So it is somewhere that the American dream and the Indian dream are congregating together, they are coalescing together, but they are definitively pitted against the Chinese dream. Now why America is so important for these countries like South Korea and Japan, and countries like Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia and the Southwest Pacific or the Indo-China region? Because United States of America, practically speaking, they are a net security provider. They are a net security provider, and it is a question which is now being raised on the American sense of responsibility. There is a maxim. I would take you down to the cultural studies, where in one of the Hollywood constructs, Spider-Man Part 1, which is an ambassadorial cinematic construct as far as American culture and American dream is concerned. His uncle, Spider-Man's uncle, when he is in the throes of death, tells him that God has given you certain superhuman qualities, but always remember, sonny boy, there happens to be a dictum that with great power comes great responsibility. So I personally agree with the general narrative that United States of America has been too inwardly inclined. They have been kind of exclusionary also, and they have not really done the kind of hard labor as it was expected for them to unfurl onto the rest of the world, where adaptation and mitigation. If you look at the climate change talks and climate change diplomacy, what we can contend is that the schism between the global south and the north is still very much present. What does the south need? Apart from a green book, apart from a green policy or a carbon neutral policy, technology, funding and adaptation measures, they need to become the order of national mechanisms in the global south. But that has not really happened. It is where, particularly in the larger context of climate change diplomacy, that New Delhi has played a great role, We have our own climate change policy where we do not agree with nations such as United States of America, and we want to make it into such a reality, the entire firmament of climate change into such a reality that funding and technology is made available to the developing world so that they can dutifully and honestly provide annual reports to the UNFCCC, that these are the measures which can point out that this is the litany of measures which have been initiated in countries like, let's say, India, Sri Lanka, or Afghanistan, or let's say the Southeast Asian group of countries, or the Indo-China region. So India has always been considered, if not the only leader, but one of the prime movers and shakers as far as the climate change concerns, human rights concerns, human trafficking concerns, and as far as the drug trafficking concerns and piracy concerns are concerned in the global south. So I personally feel that instead of completely belittling, my personal view, you might not agree with me, instead of belittling the global north completely, we can converge with the global north, and India can take up the role of being a representative, or being a modicum, or being a, what do you call, an intermediary wherein we can serve as a conduit for the third world nations or for the global south, which we have done successfully to a certain extent, wherein, as I already stated, Sri Lanka is a very glimmering example of what New Delhi is capable of if it is given the diplomatic room, leverage, and if it has the political will, which has been reflected astutely by the policy of New Delhi under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. That is my view.
So you explained about how India can take its role, and India is a representative of global south and of bargaining, can have better bargaining position with global north. As you have made the case of Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is very important country for India point of view. India has provided great assistance to Sri Lanka in its bad days. Talking about whole global south countries, what are the issues, problems? For example, American aid was driving forces once upon a time, that America comes and provided aid to all these developing countries through various multilateral institutions. Present day, global south countries has, what kind of issues do you see? Either it is debt, either it is security, either it is climate change. It all are problem, but how it can converge and can be mitigated? What is the mitigation processes? Can it be mitigated?
Definitely, it can definitely be mitigated, but still I have a pessimistic perception. I have a very pessimistic impression of how the global south is converging. Because when we talk about the global south, when we refer to the developing countries, then we can also mention, or we can relate to the BRICS grouping, which comprises of countries such as Brazil, China, India, Russia, and South Africa. Now it took in 2009, till 2009, South Africa was not a partner of the BRICS countries, of the BRICS grouping, but it went on and became a partner of the BRICS grouping, and there was a bit of consternation in the BRICS grouping itself, and as it was apparent in our discussions, of the camera discussions, one can say that BRICS is still not being able to endear itself completely to the causes, or to the problems and challenges which are being faced by the global south. But still I personally feel that with countries like India, Russia, and I'll rule out China in a very selfish and very unpragmatic manner, but through the banking mechanism which is available through BRICS. Earlier on, the BRICS leaders used to say that we are an alternative to the first world order, the new world economic order, which was initiated in the 1971 NWIECO in 71. But later on, if you look at the current BRICS summit, which was held in 2022 in February, what we are going to find is that the BRICS leaders to have gradually corrected themselves, and they have gone on to contend that we cannot have a confrontation or an antagonistic kind of a phase. We cannot completely confront the West or the North, wherein the labeling of BRICS as a complete alternative to the WTO and the World Bank, it should, that kind of a talk or that kind of a sentimental narrative should be relegated to the back burner, where BRICS will have to work in tandem with the North, and the North equivocally and reciprocally will have to work in tandem with the BRICS if the funding concerns and the general problems or challenges being faced by the global South has to be meandered across. As you told me, the challenges before the global South, I personally feel that they are too weak, they are militarily weak, they are economically dependent on the global North or even on countries like India and China. So there has to be a security concern. Development cannot happen without a very well defined and a well cobbled together security mechanism. So the South is angry. The global South is very much despondent about President Joe Biden, because the quintessential and the sacrosanct role of providing security in the Indian Ocean rim countries and in the Asia Pacific through the mechanisms such as the Quad, that has not been ably implemented by United States of America. It is here that India, after its internal strength, after developing its internal strength, after spawning its own internal naval power, it can become, if not the only, but a key security provider for the global South. So developmental concerns, to my mind, in my perception, another powerful country like India acting as a security provider, and apart from it, India needs to act as a conduit for the global South, wherein the United Nations can also do a lot through India's coercion, India's goading, through India's amplification of the concerns of global South, and we can act as an intermediary as far as the concerns of the global South are concerned. But still, I would like to continue here and contend that the true assimilation, the true mainstreaming of the global South can only become the order of the day when selfish interests like the Han interests, like the Chinese interests, they are relegated to the back burner, and for that India, in a very idealistic role, needs to undertake a lot of preparation. We need to undertake a lot of aspirational prudence before we can defeat the Chinese at their own game. Because apart from development and human security, geostrategic and security concerns too are a very intrinsic and inseparable part and parcel of the Asia Pacific firmament. So I have mentioned the challenges. Gender issues are a challenge. Then the girl child, the concerns of the girl child are a challenge, and the sovereignty concerns, that how the Indo-Chinese group of countries, they can become co-partners of the global development journey without actually harming their own national sovereignty, without compromising their singular identities. But I think some quid pro quo and some transactional exchange will have to occur through the global South also, where they will not be considered as dependencies on countries like India and US and the European countries, but still they have to have trust. They need to have mutual faith in the policies, money and the technology share that is being initiated, or that should be ideally initiated by the global North and the intermediary great powers, or the rising powers like India. That would be my take on that.
तो आधा घंटा Sir, you talked about BRICS. When we see the countries are members of countries that those are members of BRICS are somehow regional powers, and talking about China and Russia, both are superpowers. So they have great influence on world affairs. So my question is, when we talk about BRICS, do you see, you said that you are pessimistic about how Global South is pursuing and interacting with each other. You said that BRICS have corrected themselves, BRICS leaders have corrected themselves, and they tends to this cannot confront each other, so that future of the world should in their favor. So how do you see BRICS have tendencies and capabilities? Of course there is, but there is tendencies or not? Because when we see China has different approach. India, when goes in any poor countries, India go and train its people, infuse funds, and it's kind of close people to people cooperation. When it comes to China goes there, provides debts, go with their engineers, everything they takes with themselves, they construct, takes money and come back, provide loans, come back. So it is kind of putting the poor country in debt. Russia is similarly have their own tendency that it is a security provider because it is good in arms, good in ammunitions. Similarly, BRICS and South Africa both are natural resource rich countries. Brazil has its own expertise in education technologies, and somehow they are evolving semiconductor industries, and South Africa has their own leverages. So how do you see all those have different capabilities, and those all capabilities is beneficial for Global South leaders being Global South multilateral agency? Can they become?
Here we come to the phenomenal question of leadership. Now when we are working as a team anywhere, my friends here with me, they are working as a team in Jawaharlal Nehru University. I personally at my own workplace work as a team for organizational concerns. So we need to have a leader. We need to have a person who can be looked up to. Now it can be considered as a kind of a limitation, as a kind of a delimitation of the entire cause of the Global South. As I had pointed out, the challenges which are present before the Global South, in order to meet the SDGs as it was initiated in the year 2000, or later on the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and the entire, as far as these goals are concerned, we need to be practical, we need to be pragmatic, and we need a country like India, or we need a country like United States of America, which might become laughable down the road because I am coming out with such a revolutionary or such a revisionist view. But still the general idea happens to be that countries like Brazil, India, countries like South Africa, they can be conveniently given the baton. They can be given the task of leading the Global South. Definitively, they are regional powers. As you rightly pointed out, they are resource rich, and they are on the upswing as far as their own national economic narratives are concerned, as far as their economic growth stories are concerned. But there has to be trust, and if we leave the countries in Africa, to take an example, countries like Somalia, or in the Horn of Africa, countries like Congo, then we can it easily comes to the fore that given the threats of extremism, given the threats of Islamic fundamentalism, which has been initiated, which has been running rampage through the modicum of terrorist groups like Boko Haram and other groups, fragments of Al-Qaeda are still active there. So these countries are in a organic stage of their development. I am not talking about all the countries in Global South, but that can be, it can be perceived that these countries are going through a trajectory of initializing their power, wealth and growth, where they definitively have to seek the shoulders, responsible shoulders, and to be more precise, the able shoulders of countries like India, US, South Africa and Brazil, if they are able, if they want to have some kind of a global voice. Global voice might once again be a nebulous term. They need funding, they need financial help, they need diplomatic leverage, and they need able, effective, and practically quick representation in United Nations organizations, and that can be ably provided by the philanthropic zeal of countries like India, Brazil, or let's say the other BRICS countries. So that way, I would just like to conclude here for your question, for your poser, that trust should be reposed in leaders. Somebody has to take up the mantle of leadership. A nation needs to be trusted, and because these countries by some default, the BRICS countries by some default have the international leverage, have developed through their own national stories a kind of an internal girth and strength and a global voice. So they can, in my view, they can serve as a kind of a global pedestal. They can serve as a kind of a representative of really poor and disenfranchised countries like in Africa. Because if you look into the African milieu, what we are going to find is that there is a lot of talk about equality, there is a lot of talk about racism, but a country, let's take an example of India. Last 10 years odd, India has been developing at a quick pace. We have a very able and efficient leadership in New Delhi, and so that kind of a democratic experimentation is yet to occur. That kind of a democratization, that kind of a modernization, and that kind of a upgradation of the political culture is yet to occur in most of these countries. You see a cricket-like cavalcade. When the Indian team does not perform well, then issues like "Tu aaya, main gaya," that kind of a thing. A batsman comes and a batsman goes, because we are not able to face up to Waqar Yunus or to Wasim Akram. So the same kind of coups, the legacy of coups, the legacy of want of democratic apparatus in nations such as in Africa, and the immature political cultures and feedback loops in these countries, they need to be taken into account before we can actually hit out for the global south.
So you correctly said about political culture, that most of the global south countries have parochial culture, and there is also an attitude of mistrust or distrust in the leadership from other countries, which is coming from other countries like India, China, wherever it is coming. And one can pointedly said, when attitude of mistrust, attitude of pride of cultural identity attached with poverty, it becomes self-destructive. So in that case, I think global south should have a new approach, new identity. They should reshape their new identities. So my question is, how authors and philosophers are pertaining to this, because I have seen only it is developed by Western philosophers, Western theorists are theorizing in their own way that Southern cause is developed by Northern writers. So in that case, it cannot justify everything. However, they tries to justify being a behavioral aspect, they try to be neutral, but it doesn't, they aren't. So my point is, how do you see Indian authors and writers? Because Indian writers and authors are very well, they pursue the course which is already established. They are not diving into the new area. So what is your suggestion to the new authors and the new researchers who are going through this course?
Definitely, I am also a new author and a new scholar. But if my view can have some kind of a weightage or a voice, I would just contend that when we are talking about seeking support from the north, because they have the moolah, they have the resources. So practically speaking, we will have to utilize them. If we are swimming, if we are floating in a sea or in a river, then we cannot be antagonistic to the alligator or to the crocodile. We might be a small fish or we might be a bigger fish, but we need to be very practical, pragmatic, and we need to be down to earth. So when we are castigating the northern theorists, or when we are talking about the romanticism of the global south, then I personally feel that we can take recourse to diasporic literature. Now this is something which is limited to the academia, intelligentsia and the intellectual class of the country. For example, when we look into a text such as 100 Years of Solitude, this is one of the tomes which was written by a scholar, Garcia. It comes to my name. He has beautifully pointed about the entire dichotomy or the entire schism between the global north and the global south, wherein in one of the segments of his novel, 100 Years of Solitude, he talks about a very idyllic region, idyllic group, wherein he talks about a village which is yet to be inhabited by people. He very nicely picturizes, and nicely explains that there happens to be a rivulet which seems to be floating near the human habitation, and these people are not in touch. The village people are not in touch with the colonial government, which let's say runs in Rio de Janeiro, because it takes up the Argentine milieu, the Argentine context, literary milieu. So he talks about basically a primordial construct, a pre-natural construct where humans, like the Thomas Hobbesian world, they are looking into, we are just having idyllic bliss, or as Rousseau would call it, the state of nature. So we don't know how we are going to flow forward, how we are going to progress, how we are going to advance. So instead of gloating and only romanticizing about our Neolithic potential, we need to be practical. And in the 100 Years of Solitude, it is shown that people then begin to go to Rio de Janeiro. People invite the state to establish a system and go beyond the state of nature, wherein a postal shanty, postal shop is established in that village, a law and order mechanism which is represented by local and external ombudsmen, that is established. So just gloating and romanticizing about our primordial strength and superiority, civilizational superiority, we need to reach out. And definitively I agree with the Indian scholars that there has been an iota, more than an iota, of discrimination, exploitation, and the schism between the core and the periphery, as talked about by Professor Chilcote. That is definitively, the core and the periphery remains a core concern. But as you also said, a reshaping and a revisitation of the perception and the diplomatic approach and outreach of the global south, that should also be in the offing, which is what is being very practically, cleverly and very sustainably being done by India under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So that would be my contention.
Last, your comment over overall global south concerns we are doing that. What should be your comment? That how should a researcher look upon it?
How does?
Scholars like us, what should be the approach of our scholars?
No, as far as the scholars are concerned, I think a change is coming. Earlier on, we were dominated, the academic narrative, the academic literature and the general verbal space of the academia was dominated by a crassly antagonistic and a confrontationalist approach against the South. We are being no votaries of South. I am not postulating that we become subservient to the North, which nobody can do. And if somebody does that, it turns out to be on the fringes of being hilarious. So we are not being hilarious, we are not being funny here. But the only idea that comes to my mind is that the scholars can look at some kind of a balancing act. The Indian scholars can look for a balancing act, a kind of a convergence, a kind of an amalgamation, wherein a more eclectic approach towards the North-South dialogue, a more comprehensive and a balanced approach towards the North-South dialogue, moving away from the strain of confrontation and protestation and revolution. That can become the order of the day. What happens in Cancun, what happened in Cancun when all the activists who were talking against globalization and convergence. They came together and it was very good. It was a good show. The paraphernalia of talk and media was there. The fourth estate was also being very vibrant. But you know, we need to have an intrinsic delving in exercise by the South, where our limitations and our challenges, they also need to be taken into cognizance, and we can go for a handshake. We can go for a handshake with America, and India can facilitate that. Other countries can facilitate that, and the European countries do need to be responsible. But still, as I once again said, the northern policies, as is apparent in Afghanistan, as is apparent in Ukraine, they were goading these countries. They were present in these countries as the liberators. They were present there as a kind of a democracy providers or the conduits of democratization. But when the situation reached a touch and go precipice, then at that particular point of time, the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan, and also the kind of military aid, the kind of funding which is being given to Zelensky, the Ukrainian premier, that is also not up to the mark. And every second summit, talking about the G7, we are talking about other jamborees which have taken place. Zelensky is demanding that Ukraine should be given more prominence, and immediate military aid and immediate moolah ought to flow into the Ukrainian battle stations, so that the Russian designs in the entire region, in the Caucasus and in the Eurasian region, can be curtailed, or some sort of a blockade should be provided by the NATO group of countries as far as Russian hegemonic designs are concerned. I personally feel the Indian scholars need to have a broader global perception, a global perception, a pan-global perception, wherein we need to honestly adhere to our domestic and to our local concerns. But we need not forget the clarion call. Global is local and local is global, where a convergence with the global security providers and harbingers of development, that should not be relegated to the back burner, that should not be shrugged under the carpet. If a real convergence of global peace, health, stolidity, and if to be very precise, a resurgence or the rise of the Asiatic space or the developing space has to be attained. That would be my view on what all you have asked me.
Question? Thank you so much.
Okay.